Hi everyone. I'll make a start because I think we want as much time as possible for today's event. So thank you everyone for joining and welcome to the third webinar in our series Beyond BNG run by ACAN Ecology. The first episode in our series explored the recent and pioneering mandatory BNG legislation, and the second episode last month was showcasing BNG in practice. Today's episode, we're looking at topics beyond BNG into the more holistic, multi-layered approach to nature recovery. We're really excited to have four great people with us today from a real variety of backgrounds. So we're joined by Kai from UK GBC, Ian from LDA Design, Gemma from Building with Nature, and James from Feral Partnerships. They're going to introduce an area of ecological design that interests them first of all, and why we should move on to beyond statutory guidance to address the ecological crisis. And then we'll enter a short discussion afterwards. So before we begin, this webinar will be recorded for YouTube, so turn off your camera if you don't want to be seen on that. So first I'll do a short introduction about ACAN and our mission, and then we'll hear for about 5 to 10 minutes from each speaker, and then we'll have a Q&A afterwards. We're not going to be able to cover everything today, so we will leave as much space for discussion as afterwards and hopefully do some more in the future. Please do put your questions in the chat. Sian will be filtering through those, ready for the Q&A. And if you want to discuss with a specific speaker, then just put in their name. So to start us off, for those who might not know, ACAN is a voluntary network of built environment professionals campaigning for climate justice. We have three key aims, which are rapid decarbonisation of the built environment, ecological regeneration, and cultural transformation of the profession. In ACAN Ecology, our vision is for a built environment profession and industry working alongside wider ecological networks, which enables holistic and multi-species living within thriving environments. Our mission is to support and inspire, creating a hive of regenerative learning and exchange, cross-species solidarity, and ecological advocacy together. Our guiding aims are to amplify the needs of ecosystems and other species, to spread awareness of the ecological impacts of the architectural profession, and to educate and empower ourselves together, redirecting our skills to redress and reorient anthropological impacts upon others. We have a thriving WhatsApp group, so please do join us there. We tend to meet fortnightly on Fridays at 1 p.m. So first, Ian Holston will be joining us. He is Director and Landscape Architect at LDA Design, and he'll be giving us a flying introduction to ENG as the next step from BNG. So I'll hand over to you, Ian.
Thank you very much. I will share my screen with a few slides. Is that visible?
Not just yet. Let me
Still
know if you're
no?
having. No, if you're having problems, I can share.
It worked
We're
earlier.
just, we need, yeah, always the way, isn't it? There you go. Looks good.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to the group today. So I've titled this slide Beyond BNG, from BNG to ENG, from biodiversity net gain to environmental net gain.
Ian, did you want to put it full screen?
Oh, is that better?
It's not. There we go. Yep, looks good, Ian.
Good. Okay. So from BNG, from biodiversity net gain to environmental net gain, the reason being that, as we'll explore today, that there's huge opportunities and importance in taking best advantage of outcomes that deliver for ecology, but also for humans and our economy. We're all aware of the terrible trajectory we are on with regard to biodiversity decline. And if we continue on in the way we are, as built environment professionals and as a society, with a business as usual trajectory, we're in grave risk of getting to a point where we can't recover the nature we need for a habitable world. And it's as serious as that. We're one of the most nature depleted countries in the world, which is an incredible statistic. And we have to, I think, as professionals, explore every opportunity to build with nature and build for nature. But to do that, like I say, we also need to consider the benefits nature delivers for our economy and for our health and well-being. Lawton in 2010, through the Lawton Review, identified the need to operate with thinking at an ecological landscape scale for bigger, better, and better connected habitats to help nature recover. And over the years, policy and legislation has introduced the biodiversity net gain requirements. Local nature recovery strategies are emerging, and the 30 by 30 objective is a really important apex goal for the government. So we've got in place what I think we can see as absolutely essential elements of helping nature to recover. But I don't think we're going to achieve those goals if we don't see those wider benefits and exploit those to address climate change and health and well-being and several other pressures that we face. The Dasgupta Review 2021 is a really important pivotal point in ecological thinking. He identified, and we've now recognized, the essential role that nature, natural capital, serves to underpin our economy and our livelihoods and our well-being. So ecology isn't just essential for ecology's sake, it's also essential for a functioning ecology and a happy, healthy society. That means, I think, we need to challenge, as built environment professionals, the modus operandi, our business as usual thinking, and focus on new ways of working that deliver better outcomes. And some of the thinking that I'm exploring at the moment with colleagues is been around for several years, but to really zoom in on and emphasize the role of natural capital to deliver a wider ecosystem services and benefits, and to use that as a tool to really look at delivering biodiversity net gain, nature recovery in ways that also deliver cultural provisioning, regulating and supporting services, and really optimize the benefits nature provides. Small example here, and it's patently obvious that a conventional drainage strategy will address water quality and quantity, and maybe support land use and property values if it's in an area prone to flooding. But if we take a nature-based solution, deliver for biodiversity as part of that flood regulation project, we could also be delivering on several other ecosystem service benefits, optimizing the outcomes through nature-based solutions. And as built environment professionals, there's huge opportunities by using nature in the built environment to deliver social, environmental, and economic outcomes. This is a nice, simple graphic that we use to emphasize the social benefits of nature-based solutions in urban areas, reduce stress, mental well-being benefits, public realm for interaction and recreation, a sense of place and continuity with the past, and improved recovery time from illness has been improved through access and visibility of nature in hospitals. We get improved air quality, summer shade for urban cooling, rainfall infiltration, traffic calming, reduced noise impacts. And economic benefits, we can get increased property values, rental values, increased concentration and productivity of workers. So a whole host of benefits in the urban realm and through the built environment that we can be using natural capital to deliver for nature and for society and for the economy. And for those not involved in the built environment projects in urban areas, nature and nature-based solutions are equally applicable in the rural environment. One of the emerging tools that's available to support our work in this field is what's called the Environmental Benefits from Nature tool. It was relaunched version 1.1 in November, and we haven't got time to talk about it in detail today, but I'd urge people to take a look if they're not familiar, because it takes the BNG tool and offers an opportunity to explore how that BNG can deliver a wider set of ecosystem goods and services. And a bit of a promotional push, this was a magazine, The Environmental Scientist, published in September that has devoted the whole edition to net gain. And I think it's now publicly available. There's a link there, and it's a really good read. And there's an article from me in there too. But despite that, it's still a good read. That was a rapid, very quick introduction to the broad concept of ENG, and hopefully we can cover any questions later. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I realize we're asking some big questions in a very short amount of time, but it's more sort of like a start a process for thinking about it a bit more further on. Yeah, I'm interested in what your thoughts are about like the challenges of integrating this ecological thinking beyond legal requirements, especially considering there are so many benefits that we feel and see like economically as well.
Yeah, the challenge I think is currently BNG is mandated, but environmental net gain isn't mandated in policy or legislation. But I think it's safe to say there is a direction of travel towards an environmental net gain approach. ENG and the environmental benefits from nature tool are both referenced now in the new planning practice guidance, and natural policy statement for energy, EN1, refers to environmental net gain and the environmental benefits from nature tool. I suspect it's also a mode of engaging ecologists in the creative design process and built environment to optimize their placemaking outcomes. So working together across the built environment professions, collaboration with statistics, with data, with information, we should be in a really good position to deliver better designs and better solutions. So whilst it's not mandated, I think it's good practice, it's good design process, and a focus on outcomes can only be of benefit.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, looking forward to hearing a bit more later on. So yeah, save up your questions. Next, we're going to hear from Gemma Jerome, who is Director of Building with Nature and also a Fellow of the Landscape Institute. Gemma's going to be introducing their work at Building with Nature and how they see the next steps to support ecological recovery. I'll hand over to you, Gemma.
Thank you so much, Ruby. It's fantastic to be here today. And thank you for the invitation from ACAN. Really pleased that I could join. Can I just check you can hear me okay? Yeah, great. Thank you, Sean. Thanks, Ruby. Okay, so yeah, thanks for the introduction from Ian. And I don't have any slides today, so I'm just going to run through a couple of provocations and reflections on a decade working in this space of accreditation in the built and natural environment. So as Ruby kindly introduced, I have been acting as Director of Building Nature since we launched a accreditation for green infrastructure back in 2015. We started working in this space, and we've very recently joined forces with Sintali, which is a company who exist to support the environmental performance of green buildings. So we see this as a really natural twinning, the green infrastructure supporting the holistic approach to making sure that the built environment is inclusive of and enhancing of the natural environment. So I'm keen to kind of have one foot in each of those camps, but what I want to really, because we have limited time and it's sometimes a lot can kind of come out of a fairly narrow discussion and taking it into different directions, but what I want to focus on is the role of accreditation when it comes to supporting the built and natural environment, taking the trajectory we need it to. So thinking about Ian's graph there and those very stark statistics about where we are business as usual. I'm also about to take up the role of visiting practice fellow at the University of Sheffield Architecture and Landscape Architecture Department, which very exciting news, they are merging in the process of. So really also feeling that I'm among friends in the world of architecture, asking these kinds of questions. How do we move that dial so our practice is being as supportive and actually climate positive and not just neutral. When it comes to the question of supporting a holistic approach, I think accreditation can play a really powerful role. So this has been both my kind of ideological position and my experience reflecting on this chapter of developing and managing and listening to feedback from the built environment about building with nature as a green infrastructure approach and measure of performance. I think when it comes to removing some of the obstacles that still exist in the planning and development sector, I think language is really important. So I just wanted to start with that idea that we actually, if we can have a shared language across the different disciplines, it can be a very simple but effective way of making sure everybody's on the same page. Because as we all know, I imagine everybody in this room knows, the kind of advantage and disadvantage, it's kind of two sides of the same coin, I think, of having multiple disciplines working cohesively, well, ideally cohesively together to deliver places for people and wildlife, is we can get gaps and gaps in understanding and gaps in delivery, and then in the long term gaps in performance. So accreditation identifies those gaps and tries to smooth that journey from design through to delivery through to long-term management and maintenance. So that place making and place keeping continuum, accreditation ideally has a view from the very beginning of the story and then ongoing, that kind of ellipsis into, well, what is it like to live there in 10, 15, 50 years time, which is when we're actually going to see those biodiversity net gains delivered. Because as we know, that mandatory moment is just a, if all goes well, we are going to see these outputs delivered. As Ian mentioned, he mentioned outcomes, and I just want to pick up on that as well, because again, language is important. A lot of the mandatory requirements are, and understandably so, focused on what will the outputs be. When it comes to a more holistic approach, which environmental net gain, I would agree, is more holistic, thinking about green infrastructure as well as green buildings together is more holistic, then we need to think about outcomes, because we're actually talking there about things that are harder to measure, but things that actually make that meaningful difference to people's lives, whether that's human or more than human. So I think I'll just finish with a couple of I suppose ideas for thought, because I actually think when it comes to making a difference, what I found is accreditation works well and maybe best when it doesn't drive the same bottom line, when actually it's about seeing a place in its unique context. So I've mentioned language, so having standards can help with that. I've mentioned cohesion, so cohesion across the disciplinary specialists, whether that's key milestones through time, or whether it's about kind of over time, having a cohesion about what the vision for a place is, and how do we know if that vision's been delivered? So actually being able to measure. And I think in that regard, collaboration and competition, sometimes they're again are on that same edge. So accreditation can help with collaboration, either between a design team and the planning department, or between the architects, the sud specialists, the ecologists, the placemakers, and so on. And it's also about competition. So people who are bringing forward housing development, other types of development, if they see what good looks like in one area and that actually has an accreditation attached to it, then it drives up that ambition. And kind of my final idea and thought to leave you with is the role of inspiration, and that phrase of what good looks like. And we're seeing that come through even in policy with Natural England's green infrastructure standards, for example. It's that art of possible. And I just want to kind of do a pitch to architects as a disciplinary specialist. I think that's really key to what architects bring to the table, and other built environment specialists. But the art of the possible, we need more than ever the imagination, if we're going to meet the challenges of a climate positive future. So I think it's kind of stepping outside of our silos, bringing people who are going to benefit, as in the residents and the kind of beneficiaries of the places we create, bringing them to the table through co-design, through placekeeping solutions beyond that placemaking vision. So yeah, a few ideas there to kind of bring to the table that I've kind of crystallized, distilled myself through managing an accreditation system. But I look forward to the questions, and thanks, Ruby.
Thanks so much. Yeah, that was really interesting. And I think in the interest of time, and also you did such a good summary and note, we'll leave it maybe on that and pick that up again later. And I really like that, like kind of arc between accreditation and then getting to the art of the possible. Next, we'd love to hear from James Peplow-Powell. He will be looking at multi-species cohabitation from an ethical viewpoint. So James is an architect and also founder of Feral Partnerships and works between research and practice in more than human spaces. So I'll stop sharing and let you share, James.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here and maybe to speak from a slightly different standpoint, perhaps as a sort of someone engaged with design and design questions. So I'll just share my presentation here. Let me know you can see that all right. Great. So I'm going to talk about I guess an introduction to more than human design thinking, and with a particular focus on pigeons. But just to introduce this idea of more than human design, I suppose this really comes from how do we think about our relations as humans to the natural world, in a really holistic way. We're an integrated part of nature. We're not separable from it, despite the kind of silos we tend to put up around different ways of thinking and different roles. One of them I was interested in breaking down was this relationship between the architect and the ecologist, as well as the relationship between the human and the non-human. And part of the way of doing that for me was sort of embarking on a research project, which was interested in essentially the pre-industrialized relationships that we had with nature, a vast diversity of those different mutually supportive relationships that have been made obsolete by essentially fossil fuel extraction, and whether those, in that context, whether those practices have any relationship to this kind of post-fossil fuel future that we're trying to imagine. I won't talk about that larger research project today for time, but I'm going to focus just on purely this one animal, the pigeon, and our relationship to it in relation to a project I did at the Design Museum. And pigeons are an interesting subject because they kind of fall outside the frameworks of value that we have at the moment in the way we relate to the built environment, through things like bird bricks and kind of these kind of design forms, if you like, that are created by policy. We value maybe animals like the peregrine falcon and that kind of charisma in the way that the legal structures work in the built environment, but not its prey species, the pigeon, which is obviously the reason the peregrine falcon is there in the first place in our cities. We have these exclusionary tactics essentially to pigeons that are completely the opposite. They're about excluding them from our urban environments. But that wasn't always the case. We can look at today, even there are these routes that I found doing this project where pigeon care is practiced by people in ways that are really challenging to our understandings of what's of value today. If we're a little bit older, we might remember, I don't personally, but going to Trafalgar Square and feeding the birds, as we kind of know from Mary Poppins, the fact that pigeons had a very different relationship with citizens of London not too long ago. And before that, we had the kind of mass involvement in sports, such as like pigeon racing, their role in the world wars as messengers, and these range essentially of creative and cultural value that came with the utility of that animal. But one architecture I was particularly interested in was the dovecote, these were essentially agricultural infrastructures that were designed for pigeons, because they're essentially their guano, their droppings, were the most valuable agricultural fertilizer you could get your hands on. to the extent that guards were placed outside these buildings and you had to give a ration to the army and things like this. So there were these incredible structures that were built for the collection of guano, really as a sort of infrastructural multi-species, human infrastructure, such as these in Iran, but kind of throughout history and wherever they do, they pick up the kind of cultural and architectural language of each region. And although there have been more recent types showing here, like the example in Oscar Niemeyer's example in the center of Brasilia, and a more recent sort of postmodernist version that's been built in France, most of these now lie in ruins. And the reason, of course, is that the use of these pigeons to support a sustainable agricultural system, that's fallen away. That's been replaced by extractive economies around the industrial production of ammonia. So really pigeons emerge almost, our current treatment emerges as a sort of mirror image of extraction and of fossil fuel based sources of sources of fertility production, and all of the incredible negative results that come from that through climate breakdown and through the runoff of fertilizer and kind of the destruction of aquatic ecosystems. So there was a question for me: what relevance maybe does that typology of the dovecote and that sustainable agricultural system have to today? And for me, the question was to think about how does that happen in an urban setting, and looking at the kind of my client being Transport for London, and if you like, pigeons are going around the city gathering up food waste that's dropped on the streets and then bringing all that fertility back to Transport for London, the network, and dumping it in a really problematic way on their network. So they're thinking they have these externalizing management systems about how they deal with pigeons on the network. So for me, it was about proposing an alternative management system that also captured the benefits of pigeons historically to create a potentially a kind of circular urban system that then can be redistributed to a kind of practice of urban farming where fertility no longer flows from rural areas to the city and then out into the sea through kind of waste, but actually starts to think about how the city might become a circular system. And of course, the pigeon's abilities once again come back to be a key agent in that process. So I designed a dovecote that kind of talked to the kind of industrial design language of TfL, but does this kind of more than human design in terms of the way it provides for pigeons, and then how that might be installed in a kind of urban infrastructure system. So that's a very quick run through, I think, of a project that starts to think maybe about what the possibilities are outside of legal frameworks. It's a kind of very different proposition, and maybe talking about the future directions. If we think about how more than human design might end up in sort of design and policy making, but thinking through holistically between the relationships between animals and humans and how that tells a story about climate breakdown. So I'll just point you towards two documents. One is the publication that went with this project, where I expand a bit more on this in sort of a written form. And the other is a journal that's just come out of the Design Museum, called More Than Human, which is an exploration of how more than human thinking and design is working in practice, and also its implications for strategic sort of policy making for the future. So this link, I think, is on the left there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, definitely recommend following up on those. Very, very briefly, if you can, I'm interested to think about how this changing our attitude towards design for multi-species could change the way that we value the individual as well as quantity, because I know biodiversity often looks at sort of like mass numbers, whereas your study is much more about individuals.
Well, yeah, I think it's two things. I think it's what is not captured by metrics. And I think we really need to get this right at this point. We don't get a second chance. And what are we missing out by just looking at what's captured by biodiversity? And for me, I think there's elements of kind of thinking about green infrastructure that could really be expanded. I think this is just one example of that. Yeah, and I think maybe less sort of individual, but what's the relationship, and what's the relationship in terms of the cultural and everyday practices that we have with other species. And if this is kind of have a a robust kind of long-term shift towards kind of introducing ecology holistically into our lives again, and in terms of the infrastructure to support us, we need to start to think about those cultural values, and to think about how we can retell stories about our relationships with nature in a different way. Yeah, so I think it's maybe that relationship that starts to speak to a personal level, maybe.
Mm. Thank you. Yeah, we'll come back to that in a bit. So finally, we're going to hear from Kai, and Kai is joining us from UK GBC, where he is Head of Nature and Resource Use. And we'll now be extending the discussion to off-site biodiversity with an introduction to embodied ecological impacts. A bit of a whistle-stop one again. Take it away, Kai.
Thank you very much. Does the screen share come through?
Yeah, great.
Fantastic. Cool. So I will talk about our work on embodied ecological impact. So as you've seen throughout this webinar, we've kind of been expanding scope from BNG to ENG accreditation, now more than human design, and now I intend to broaden the perspective or add another perspective once again, and that is the one of embodied ecological impact. It's one of our core work streams since 2022. Last year, we've launched an online platform on the topic. A couple of weeks back, we had a conference that attracted more than 100 people on that. So it's definitely a growing area. We do a lot of work on it and don't have any intention to stop. So let me show you what we mean. First of all, I think it's important to quickly zoom out again and ask ourselves, why are we talking about nature and biodiversity here in the first place? I think we all know what the problem is, rapid biodiversity loss that's happening at a dizzying pace worldwide. We probably all know the figures, things like we're overshooting 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries, or the one that we're seeing here on the screen, that we have lost 73% of wildlife populations in the last 50 years or since 1970, which is absolutely shocking. So we're in a very dire situation. Why is that? That figure is from the Living Planet report from the WWF. Depends a little bit by the region, but mainly one of the major impacts is habitat loss and degradation. If you then look into what they actually mean by habitat loss and degradation, you find 3 things mainly. It's agriculture, it's infrastructure and development, and it's the extraction of materials. And that's where the embodied ecological impacts kind of fit in the extraction of material bit. And we do extract a lot of materials. I think probably a lot of us have heard about this stat before. Human-made materials now outweigh the entire Earth's biomass, which when I heard it the first time, I was absolutely shocked. It's crazy. 90% of all of that is in the built environment. So there is a lot of material that the built environment consumes that we lock into the built environment. And all of these materials, they need to come from somewhere. And this somewhere where they are extracted from, is where a lot of the ecological impact happens. So what do we do as the built environment? How do we design the built environment doesn't wreck ecosystems globally? I have a lot of conversations with built environment professionals on this, and most of the time when I talk to people, I get pretty much the same responses: deliver on BNG, urban greening, green walls, green roofs. All of this is hugely important. We heard it in Ian's presentation at the beginning. There are lots of different benefits that this produces: increased health and well-being, a reduction of noise, lowering air pollution, creating community space, and yes, also an increase in biodiversity. But all of these actions pretty much focus very much on the space, on where we built, on the red line boundary, on our towns and our cities. However, what they're not suitable for necessarily is to tackle these global figures of 73% biodiversity loss or loss of wildlife species that we've seen, these planetary boundaries being overshot, and all of this is not necessarily captured by these on-site measures by biodiversity net gain, by urban greening. So we need to think along slightly different lines here if we want to address this holistically as the built environment. Because where we're not looking at when we look at urban greening and green roofs, green walls, are things like what we see here on the screen. So that is an iron mine located in the Amazon rainforest. It's iron that we use a lot for the steel production, and we use a lot of steel in our buildings. And as you can see here, this is quite a disastrous outcome for a rainforest, because iron ore is mined as a surface mine or open pit mine, meaning it happens on the surface, and you need to get rid of everything that is there in the first place in order to get that material out. So in that rainforest, it means you need to take the trees out, you need to take the topsoil out, and you dig out the iron ore, and what you replace it with is these big ponds, and they contain something that's called tailings, which is basically a highly toxic substance. These dams are known to fail. There's a lot of a long history of these ones flooding the area around it, so that can really cause havoc on natural ecosystems. That is just one example. This is iron ore. You've got the similar issue with bauxite mines for aluminium. You've got sand, you've got aggregates. You know, all of these materials that we look at in the built environment, they all have issues in similar ways, all in their own way though. So when we talk about embodied ecological impact, that is what we mean, what you see here on the screen. So these are all similar to embodied carbon. These are all the impacts that happen via the supply chain throughout the life cycle, not necessarily on the site, but elsewhere. Material extraction point at the end of life. We mainly focus on the material extraction point because it is the biggest impact if you look at the life cycle of it. So in that sense, it is quite similar to embodied carbon, which is why we gave it that title, because it allows us to apply a similar kind of mindset that we've already learned on the carbon journey to the ecological journey. I'm not going to go too much into detail on this, but this is one of the outputs that we've created. I'll put the link here so you can follow it. It is a map on that website where what you can see here in light green are biodiversity hotspots, and then you can overlay it with different materials, and it shows you where they extracted it. It shows you circles of increased extractive activity, and then you can go into certain material pages for all of these 5 materials that you see here, and you get a little bit more information. It's all high level, but it gives you a little bit of an understanding of what the key ecological impacts are of these materials. And just to finish, I know it's we're very tight on time here today. Just to finish, a couple of recommendations. What can we do in order to start addressing it? If it's not incorporating nature-based solutions or biodiversity net gain, what else can we do? I've got these 4 points here. Focus on what matters. So it's like, I think rather than having a clear-cut response on you need to do this or that, is as an organization, focus on, have a look at where do you think your main impacts are. It is likely to be the materials that you use in the built environment. What are the most impactful ones to address this? How can you drive this down? One way of driving this down is the circular economy. And I think that's a really good story, that circular economy is a good tool in order to combat these embodied ecological impacts, because it is also a good tool to lower our carbon emissions. So that is, a lot of these things converge actually when we look at carbon and ecological impact. So use the circular economy basically to cut out the use of virgin materials, which are the ones that cause the big impact in the first place. One thing that we found over the last 2 years of working on this, it is really hard to have reliable data to measure this on a project basis. We're getting better and better at measuring biodiversity impacts globally, and sort of remote sensing and all of these kinds of things. But if you want to address the impacts that you have on a project or within a project on nature, it is really hard. So what we found is at this point in time, it's probably best not to focus too much on data and measuring, but on action. As I said before, circular economy, try to lower your amount of virgin material that you use, refurbish, don't build new. And then lastly, engaging with the supply chain. One of the big issues that we have in the built environment is that there is a huge lack of transparency in the supply chain. So by asking your suppliers, your manufacturers, information about where does your material come from? Do you have any idea on the impact? That would help a lot. We're actually at the moment creating a questionnaire that sort of allows you to ask the right question and coordinate which questions to ask your supply chain in the built environment, so that we're all kind of broadly asking the same questions to get a clearer picture of transparency in the built environment. And I leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think that's a really nice note to end on, bringing it back to sort of a what can we do in an activist sort of form. I know we put kind of a lot of things out there to just pick up a couple of strands. We're talking about the cultural connection that we have to nature, and the kind of the art of the possible, like as designers, like how we can create that kind of personal connection that we feel. And then we also had these kind of like on-site versus off-site, looking at some similar and some maybe slightly different approaches to that from financial point of view, and also to this kind of like connection activist point of view. And I think thinking sort of as a comparison of carbon, which we maybe think about and regulate a little bit more in the industry so far, maybe starting with Kai and then chipping in with Ian or whoever else wants to chip in, like thinking about net zero targets, how might that impact the amount of minerals that we rely on, and could that sort of sway a priority towards on-site versus off-site if we are trying to meet net zero?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think we need to think these two things through together. You can't just look at net zero alone and then you still continue to use lots of glass, lots of steel. The energy transition is a huge one as well, although the metals and the minerals that you need for that. And yeah, you definitely need to consider these things together. And yeah, it's not just a matter of, I often get asked the question, okay, what's the alternatives then? If we don't use steel, if we don't use concrete, what's the material? Tell me what's the material that we use instead. And I always say it's not that simple. It's not like a matter of exchanging material A for material B and then continue on business as usual. We just need to find ways of completely rethinking this. And I think for me, it always comes back to not building new buildings if we don't really need to. And I think that's one of the key things that we can do, because it tackles so many of these issues at once. I don't know whether this answered your question or whether there was another point that I haven't answered correctly now.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. And I think it also brings us back to this idea of like maybe ecology playing a role in the kind of like net zero via offsetting. It's not the same as net zero via not building or improving something that's already there. Yeah,
I'd also say just quickly we also need to be careful not to try to just replicate the net zero journey, because it's these are fundamentally different things. Net zero carbon is basically about releasing a molecule in the atmosphere, and within reason, no matter where you do this on the planet, it has a certain impact of a warming climate. Biodiversity and ecosystems work entirely differently. This is a highly localized issue. There are a lot of moving parts there, highly interconnected. So it's not as simple as like, what's the metric? What's the number? How can I drive this down? It needs to have a much more thoughtful approach.
For sure. And I think like remembering also like picking up on a bit of what James was saying, that like there are other agents involved, because like they offer parts and contribute towards the ecology and the carbon themselves. Yeah, I guess also, Ian, what were your sort of thoughts on that in terms of more of the ENG on site?
Well, it's
and net
I think
zero?
we're opening many cans of very interesting worms through this discussion. It's great. maybe the pigeons can eat them. I don't know. I'm an optimist, fundamentally, and it feels like we're on a trajectory, both as a society and as a built environment collective. And my hope is if we start to see the environment as a piece of infrastructure, environmental infrastructure is a term I've sort of coined to describe that. So it's an essential part of living human systems. Environmental infrastructure, just like built infrastructure and transport infrastructure and energy infrastructure, is needed to support our lives. So if we start to think of it in those terms, we can leverage the investment into the environment that we need to see to address all the points that all of the speakers today have been raising around biodiversity, climate change, health and well-being. What we need to do is change hearts and minds, but we also need to develop the evidence that is supportive of making decisions that involve nature-based solutions and address some of those issues that Kai's raised. We're on a trajectory looking towards a shift from environmental impact assessment to environmental outcomes reports is evidence that we're going to start to measure things differently. What good looks like is something that Gemma raised earlier. And by pivoting towards better systems, better regulatory systems, better reporting systems, we can get ourselves into the position where all of the evidence, all of the information is presented in ways that people understand. And I think James said something really important earlier around the relationship to nature, and a lot of this and a lot of demand has been emerging from the public around the need for us to do better as professionals, because people value and understand nature more, and the more we can educate and involve people in the decisions we make around the design solutions and placemaking and all that sort of stuff that address people's concerns, the next generation are hungry for better environmental infrastructure and better decisions and better use of steel and carbon and concrete and stuff. So like I said, I'm really optimistic, but it really is up to us to change what we do and how we do it, and keep up the momentum on the trajectory that we found ourselves on.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds really great. And I know, Gemma, you've got your hand up there, and anyone do jump in if you have something that you want to say. But that really links into what you were talking about. And I loved what you were saying also about the placemaking versus placekeeping and kind of like that continuum.
Yeah, thanks to Kai and Ian and for building the momentum around what's turning into a really interesting discussion. Yeah, I love webinars for that. So I think I just wanted to chip in with a couple of thoughts musing through my mind. And although I'm not an architect coming to the table, I'm a planner, which is a bit more of a kind of, I like to call us the brilliant generalists. I'm sure we do get called a lot of less positive things. So it's our fault for everything is usually my disclaimer. But I think I just wanted to kind of pose the kind of statement, which obviously can be challenged, but I think it's a truism that places exist for a long time, hopefully, with climate chaos, we just had another really disastrous storm, but places exist for a long time, and we therefore need, as built and natural environment professionals, to have that at the front of our mind when we're designing and building, because we need spaces to be as flexible as possible. You know, one thing we've all learned over the last 5 years, I think, I hope, is there's predictable, and that's where trends and data management and monitoring come into play. And we systems thinkers and kind of technical experts, we're great at all of that. But then there's the unpredictable, like a global pandemic. And you know, we need spaces to be as flexible as possible for the baseline reasons, like communities change, you know, changing populations, growing and aging populations, trends can be predicted to a point, but then what people want, as much as algorithms and digital culture might try and predict trends, there's a lot of unpredictability as well. We couldn't have anticipated a global pandemic. Then suddenly we had office spaces that were redundant, and now they're coming back online. Suddenly everybody had time to be in the park. Something said Ian about changing hearts and minds. Whilst I agree with that, it got me thinking, actually, when people had the time and space, their hearts and minds were ripe and ready to go. They just, they were ready to be in nature. We actually had a problem with people in kind of the national parks, not necessarily being as kind of kind or respectful to the wildlife as they could have been. So I think there's something about creating flexibility from a material point of view. I was once heading up an art space in Liverpool, which previously had been a bike workshop, and before that had been a forgery, and it was knocked down to create a single kind of one-trick pony student flats block. I mean, that's a whole story, and we know it inside out. But the more flexible spaces can be for predictable and unpredictable trends, that has to be a material issue. The same with green spaces. We always talk about, just bring it back to your point about the placekeeping, placemaking continuum, Ruby. We want people to come on board and feel like they belong and own the spaces that we professionals are parachuted into to create, to vision, hopefully in a participatory way, and then leave and then walk away. So, how people then create those spaces and recreate over and over and over is key to a climate resilience as well. And just to mention soil and plants also have a material, the biomass has a climate impact as well as the kind of the building materials as well. So and there's lots to be said about that, which we don't have time to go into, but there are some really interesting discussions happening about, fat soil is still regarded as a waste product in the construction industry, which is not cool. So there's things changing, but yeah, just a couple of points. Thank you.
Yeah, that is a super interesting point, and maybe I'll resist opening an extra can of worms on there. So maybe we can do a separate one on that. But yeah, James, I kind of wondered what you thought about that placemaking, placekeeping, and like through the lens of like more than human spaces, and how we might be able to open that up to other animals and plants that also impact our spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I love the idea of placekeeping in terms of how it sort of foregrounds maintenance and these kind of, maybe less politically attractive ideas, maybe in terms of, we often think that the green transition needs to be maybe sort of quite flashy or polished or constantly moving forward in terms of technology, but a lot of it is not that. It's about, sort of just how do we generate attitudes and communities of care around the spaces in which we live. And how does that care extend beyond just sort of purely the human communities? I mean, in the longer version of my presentation, we go kind of beyond the pigeons. I think pigeons are an interesting example where those attitudes of care are so evidently not there that they almost raise questions. But there are other animals. There's a kind of really long history about how attitudes of care have been fundamentally, integral to the way that people have made their lives on the planet. And continue to be, but they're just very buried. So I guess this question of, if we concentrate on place and of this kind of more than human constitution of place, it links to thinking around processes of participation in terms of who gets to make spaces. And we often think of that in terms of the kind of human authorship, maybe the architect, and those are still unresolved battles in terms of the kind of relationship of the designer and the kind of human community. But we can also learn from those in terms of how we start to think about the modern human community. The existing, how do we think about the place of the existing wildlife in a space in terms of thinking about the resilient future of that space, and how does what nature has to tell us as designers, how does that work? There are examples in Europe now around thinking around multi-species democracy. I'd also signpost to a recent set of projects by DEFRA's Futures team around the Interspecies Council, around, for example, one of the projects was on the river roading, and how thinking around the future of that place had to think about more than just people and more than just human interests. I think what's of interest to me is, like, I guess we've all presented maybe slightly different ways of thinking through that question, in a way, like what's captured in environmental net gain for the modern human. And I think the point of modern human design is you start to break down the barrier that sort of tends to obscure the interests of the modern human. And we start to think that we have to think about both in order to have a sustainable future.
Yeah, super interesting.
Can I just quickly
Please, yeah.
bounce off that, if that's okay, Ruby. Yeah, something that occurred to me, and James really spoke to this point as well, I think, is if we're not careful, because we exist in this particular process of design and approval, which can feel, when we're up against it with deadlines and client demands and so on and so forth, can feel quite linear, when actually the nature of everything is far from it. And so obviously, I don't want to come across as so idealistic that, you know, we need to work within a systems whilst it's being hopefully evolved from the inside out. But there is something that's occurred to me over and over again, working in this sector in this way, is that there is so much privilege and bias. Well, there's a privilege in the bias towards the front end of design. So much time, resource, skill, talent, etc., goes into that approval process, and then the first stage of a place being made. And I think everything James was saying, and it's so good to hear and see, not just language, but kind of meaningful processes and kind of agency emerging around more than human and kind of democratic processes, for that to be factored in and given weight and kind of value within the built environment decision making. But I think we always, maybe a provocation for the whole room really, is to just keep in mind, within the pressure that we have on a kind of project management basis, that there is a great privilege. We are in a privileged position, but actually places, in terms of the quality of a place and how it feels to live somewhere, whether you're a human or another species, that is often in the long term. It's constantly changing. So I think more of a shift towards thinking about maintenance is really, really key. And I suppose, just to bring it back to accreditation very briefly, part of what I'm really passionate about when it comes to accreditation, which I think BNG does fall down on, and I'm not here to criticize BNG, that's a whole other webinar, and you've had two of them, or to supplement that idea, is it's how we actually can continue the energy around a place being able to deliver those outputs and outcomes in the long term. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges that we face. I mean, that's the title of this talk, isn't it? Kind of beyond BNG, how do we ensure those places are great, joyful, and healthy, and survivable, as well as sustainable. And that's a challenge for all of us, I think, beyond that design process.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm aware of the time, annoyingly, but yeah, hopefully we can do some more of these. I think it's been a really great discussion. If anyone else has anything that they wanted to finish up on, it's nice to finish on that kind of like activist note. So any thoughts of like what we can do in our own roles in the built environment profession, or as people interested in the built environment profession and all kind of occupying the built environment?
I'll chip in just very briefly, picking up on something Gemma said. It is a privilege to be a built environment professional, and to be a designer, and with that privilege comes responsibility. So I think it is really beholden on us to change to an outcomes focused approach, to have the confidence to do that, to invest in research, and also invest in that collaborative, iterative way of working that involves a wider demographic of people, holding the pen lightly so that we can involve other people to optimize the outcomes from various different perspectives, including the communities of place and the communities of future. And also a really important thing, and it doesn't really get referenced enough, design for the future. Don't design for 2024. We need to be designing for 2080, 2090, with the climate change impacts in mind, and build resilience from today. And I'll happily shut up now.
I've reinforced that point on the outcomes. I think, considering how much resources we use to bring in my point of the embodied ecological impacts and the how we wreck ecosystems globally on that. I think we need to really carefully think about the outcomes for society that we want to achieve with our architecture. Why do we build in the first place? What's the need for that? And then try to deliver that need with a minimum resource throughput as possible. Don't build anything new if we don't absolutely have to.
I would just add maybe one last thought. We tend to think of ecology as a kind of limitation. It's, I can't build around and have impact on these species. But if we get the right mindset and right kind of approach to other humans, throughout history, they've been critically important to how we've lived on the planet as an ally, as an agent, as actually expanding our abilities to live in the world. So if we have the right mindset to design, we should get to that same place where they are a critical part of what makes a place. Apologies, yeah, critical part of what makes a place healthy, livable, and ultimately, yeah, human.
Yeah, thank you. What a lovely note to end on. And yeah, I'd add to that as well, like we are humans as well. So like our impact can be also like critical. Thank you so much everyone for joining us. And please do join the WhatsApp group. We might be a little bit quiet over Christmas, but we'll definitely be kicking off again in the new year. And we'd love to sort of like have people who are engaged, and we share resources there. We have conversations and expand kind of all of our skills and learning. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you everyone for joining us.